An old man stood in line at a pharmacy and counted coins with trembling hands. He couldn't afford to pay for his medicine, and the impudent pharmacist started to mock the old man. Everything changed the moment Keanu Reeves stepped out of the line. His selfless act will make your heart stop and will not leave anyone indifferent. Friends, let us know in the comments under what conditions you watch this video. In the background, while working, or during lunch. Also, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow another emotional story will be waiting for you. The evening was setting in. A cold wind swept through the empty streets of the city's outskirts, where life moved at its own slow, almost imperceptible pace. At the corner of two roads stood a small pharmacy, ordinary, like hundreds of others, with dimly lit windows and a large sign on the door that read, "Open 24 hours." Inside, silence reigned, occasionally broken by the mechanical beeping of the cash register as the pharmacists processed another transaction. The air carried the sharp scent of medicine, mixed with the faint mustiness of old newspapers stacked near the entrance. There were only a few customers inside. A young couple stood by a shelf filled with vitamins and dietary supplements. The woman, dressed in a long beige coat, carefully examined the labels, while the man, sighing tiredly, pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the news feed. They spoke in hushed tones, completely absorbed in their own world, oblivious to everything happening around them. Near the register stood a businessman, a man in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in this small pharmacy. He tapped his foot impatiently against the floor, glancing repeatedly at the watch on his wrist. His phone buzzed constantly, and each time he received a new notification, his eyebrows furrowed slightly in irritation. He was clearly in a hurry, and every minor delay in the store only made him more agitated. Behind the counter stood a young pharmacist named Alex. His expression suggested absolute indifference to everything happening around him. His dark hair was carelessly styled, and a slight smirk of superiority played on his lips. He mechanically scanned items without even looking up at the customers. His colleague, Sarah, stood slightly to the side, checking invoices. She was less overtly condescending, but when a customer tried to ask about a medication, her responses were brief and reluctant. Near the entrance stood an elderly man. He was around 75 years old, dressed in a worn-out coat, with a wool sweater peeking out from underneath. His shoes, once sturdy and well-made, were now scuffed and slightly misshapen. In his hands, he clutched a piece of paper covered in neat handwriting, a list of medications. He hesitated, as if weighing something in his mind. His thin face bore signs of exhaustion, but his eyes still held a quiet dignity, the kind that refused to plead or beg. His name was Henry, and tonight, he had come here with an important mission. In the pocket of his coat, he gripped a small handful of coins he had painstakingly saved over the past few days. He knew all too well that it wouldn't be enough, but he had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, he slowly stepped toward the register. The pharmacy door swung open, and a gust of cold air rushed inside. A man in a black jacket, jeans, and a simple t-shirt entered. He moved unhurriedly, his posture relaxed and effortless. His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on a few people waiting in line. His face was distinctive, tired, yet attentive. Loose waves of dark hair framed his face, falling just past his shoulders. He took his place in line like any other customer, but his eyes began to observe everything around him more closely. This was Keanu Reeves. Keanu never liked being recognized immediately. He deliberately tried to blend into the background, especially in places like this. He had only come in to buy some painkillers, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But something about this pharmacy caught his attention almost instantly. His gaze lingered on Henry, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way he clutched the list of medications to his chest as if afraid to let it go. Keanu watched discreetly, He didn't yet know who this man was, but he could already sense that Henry's visit here was about more than just an ordinary purchase. He remained in line, waiting to see what would happen next. Henry slowly approached the register, clutching the list of medications in his hands. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to take the next step before placing the yellowed piece of paper in front of the young pharmacist. His fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the realization that the next few minutes would determine whether his wife would receive the medicine she so desperately needed. Alex, without even looking up, mechanically took the list and began entering the medication names into the computer. Beside him, Sarah leaned in slightly, whispering something with a barely concealed smirk. They weren't in a hurry. They already knew how this would end. It wasn't the first time they had seen a situation like this. Well, Alex finally drawled, glancing at the total. A smug grin tugged at his lips. Trying to stretch every penny again, old man? Henry stiffened as if struck. He slowly uncurled his fingers, allowing the coins in his pocket to clink softly. Without a word, he reached for them, trying to quickly count the sum. His movements were slow, his fingers unsteady. Time seemed to freeze, and the silence that followed only heightened the tension in the air. Sarah sighed mockingly as she leaned toward Alex. If you can't afford it, maybe it's better not to get sick, huh? Alex let out a short laugh, placing the receipt in front of Henry so he could clearly see the total. The numbers seemed overwhelming. Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to recount his small pile of change, but he already knew the truth. He was short. Behind him, the businessman tapped his foot impatiently, glancing at his watch before rolling his eyes. Can this old guy just move aside so the rest of us can actually buy something? I don't have time for this circus. A few customers exchanged glances. Someone chuckled quietly, another shrugged indifferently, but no one spoke up for the elderly man. The pharmacy was warm, yet Henry felt an icy chill creep over him. Shame, humiliation, despair. He slowly raised his eyes to Alex, as if hoping to see a shred of sympathy. Instead, he was met with nothing but indifference. I'm sorry. His voice was barely above a whisper. I just need another moment to count. Carefully, he gathered the coins back into his pocket, tucked the list of medications away, and stepped aside, making room for the next customer. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his steps grew even slower. He made his way to a small chair in the corner of the pharmacy and sat down, lowering his head. Pulling the small handful of change onto his lap, he began counting again. The silence that had settled after his words lasted only a few seconds, but Keanu Reeves felt it like a punch to the gut. He had watched the entire scene unfold before him. The fingers that had been holding a few bills in his pocket curled into a firm grip. His eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a tight line. This was no longer just a simple trip to the pharmacy. This was no longer just an observation. Keanu felt it deep inside. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. His expression changed. Determination flickered in his eyes. He took a step forward. Henry sat in the corner of the pharmacy, hunched over the small pile of coins on his lap. His fingers slowly moved through them, as if hoping that by some miracle, the total would change on his next count. He tried to gather his thoughts, to push back the wave of shame and despair threatening to consume him. Soft but deliberate footsteps approached. Henry lifted his eyes and saw a tall man in a black jacket standing before him. The stranger wasn't in a hurry. His dark eyes carried a warmth and genuine concern that caught Henry off guard. "Are you all right?" the man asked, his voice calm and steady. Henry hesitated. He was used to indifference, to people walking past without stopping, without asking, without caring. His lips twitched as if he wanted to brush it off, to say something like, "I'm fine," but the words wouldn't come out. Yes, he finally managed, lowering his head back to the coins, hoping to hide his emotions. But the man didn't leave. "I'm sorry if I seem intrusive," he said, crouching down to Henry's level. "But I saw how they treated you, and I want to help." Henry flinched. "Help?" He looked up again, studying the man carefully. There was no pity in his voice, only sincerity. A lump formed in Henry's throat, and after a deep breath, he finally spoke. "You know," Henry began, "a long time ago I used to teach kids music, violin, piano. I watched their eyes light up when they played their first correct note, when their fingers finally found the right keys with ease. That was my life." He allowed himself a small smile, but it quickly faded. "But time catches up with you. The school closed, and I was let go. I found work at the local library, stacking books, helping kids pick out stories. But the pay is low, and I can only work occasionally because..." His voice faltered. "Because my wife has been bedridden since her stroke. I can't leave her alone for too long." Henry lowered his head again, his fingers absent-mindedly shifting the coins. "I have almost no money left," he continued, his voice strained with emotion. "But I can't ask my kids or grandkids for help. They have their own lives, their own families. I don't want to be a burden. I have to handle this myself. I always have." Keanu remained silent, listening intently. His face remained calm, but his eyes reflected deep understanding. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to respond. He simply sat there, giving Henry the space to speak. "But now, I think I've failed," Henry whispered. His voice barely carried the words. He clenched his fist, closing his eyes. "I came here thinking I could make it work. But I was wrong. And now, I don't know what to do." He sighed and slowly opened his hand again, looking down at the small pile of change. A few coins that wouldn't change anything. Silence filled the air, thick, heavy with emotion. Henry no longer tried to hide the truth, and Keanu, sitting beside him, didn't feel like just a listener. He felt like someone who truly understood. Finally, Keanu lifted his head and, in a quiet but firm voice, said, "I know what to do." Keanu slowly rose to his feet and extended a hand to Henry. The elderly man hesitated for only a moment before sighing and accepting the help. Together, they walked toward the register. The conversations in the pharmacy ceased, and all eyes followed this unexpected pair. Alex, noticing Henry's return, curled his lips into a disdainful smirk. "Oh, the old man is back? Found some extra cash?" he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. Sarah scoffed, exchanging amused glances with Alex. The businessman in line glanced at his watch and let out a loud sigh, clearly expressing his irritation. Keanu remained unfazed by their rudeness. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet fire of determination in his eyes. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his bank card, placed it on the counter, and spoke clearly and firmly. "Yes, I'll pay." Silence fell over the pharmacy. No one had expected this turn of events. The businessman raised his eyebrows. The young couple stopped whispering to each other, and even Sarah, who usually echoed Alex's condescending attitude, looked slightly unsettled. Alex stood in stunned silence for a few seconds before regaining his composure and glancing at Keanu. "Sir, you do realize that this..." "Ring up the total." Keanu's voice was calm but absolute. Alex hesitated for a brief moment, but then, without another word, obeyed. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the medications. The receipt printed out with a mechanical beep, and he handed it to Keanu. Keanu took the receipt, but before giving the bag of medicine to Henry, he turned to face the people in line. His gaze swept across their faces, the businessman who had rolled his eyes, the young couple who had stood idly by, Sarah, who now looked down in discomfort, and finally Alex, who fidgeted slightly, adjusting the collar of his shirt. When Keanu spoke, his voice was soft, yet filled with unmistakable strength. Today, you all witnessed a man struggle to buy medicine for his wife. He was only a little short, but instead of helping, all he received was ridicule. Why? Why have we become so indifferent? A heavy silence filled the room. No one knew how to respond. Keanu's words, simple yet without a trace of anger, cut deeper than any accusation ever could. The pharmacy door swung open again, and a man in a jacket stepped inside. He took one look at the scene before him, and his eyes widened in astonishment. "Wait, is that Keanu Reeves?" he exclaimed. The silence shattered. The people in line shifted their gazes back to Keanu. Their expressions transformed, from confusion to realization. At last, they understood who had been standing among them and what they had just witnessed. Alex shrank back, his confidence evaporating. Sarah stepped away, unsure where to look. The businessman, who had been grumbling moments ago, now seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Keanu said nothing in response to the man's outburst. Instead, he simply handed the bag of medicine to Henry and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you have everything you need," he said softly. "But this isn't over yet." Henry took the bag of medicine with trembling hands, clutching it to his chest, as if afraid it might vanish. His eyes glistened, but he held back his tears. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His face showed a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He could hardly believe this was real. Keanu reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and discreetly placed a thin envelope into Henry's hands. "This isn't charity," he said quietly, looking Henry straight in the eyes. "This is justice." Henry looked down at the envelope, then back at Keanu. He quickly realized what was inside and shook his head, hesitantly trying to hand it back. "No, I can't accept this. It's too much." But Keanu gently placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, stopping him. "Pass the kindness forward if you can," he said with a warm smile. Henry held his breath for a moment. He could no longer hold back his emotions. His shoulders trembled slightly, but not from weakness. This was relief. He gripped the envelope tightly and nodded, unable to find his voice. Somewhere behind them, someone whispered, "This is incredible." Then, louder, filled with genuine admiration, "Mr. Reeves, you are amazing." Keanu gave a small, humble smile and responded calmly, "Be just as amazing for someone else." The pharmacy seemed frozen in time. Alex and Sarah stood silently behind the counter, unable to meet the eyes of the customers. Their arrogance had dissolved, leaving only an awkward sense of shame. The businessman, who had been so impatient just moments ago, now averted his gaze, as if realizing how easily he could have helped, but chose not to. The young couple stood close together, their faces filled with quiet embarrassment and newfound understanding. Henry slowly made his way toward the exit, but this time he did not walk with his head down, burdened by worries. He walked tall, carrying with him not just the medicine, but a renewed sense of hope and faith in humanity. As the door closed behind him, Keanu was no longer standing at the counter. He was already outside, blending into the evening crowd. He hadn't just performed a good deed. He had left behind a lesson, a reminder that kindness still matters, and those who had witnessed it tonight would never forget. Friends, this story is a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life, or at the very least, make an impact. We often fail to notice those in need, yet each of us holds the power to make the world a better place. In this story, Keanu Reeves showed us that kindness is not about status or wealth. It is a choice we make every day. Remember this story the next time you see someone who needs support. don't walk past them, don't turn away. Sometimes, a simple act of attention, a kind word, or a small gesture can be the ray of hope someone desperately needs. As Keanu said, be just as amazing for someone else. Be sure to share your impressions of the story in the comments and write what conclusions you have drawn after listening to it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I wish you all a good mood and see you in the new video tomorrow.